Well, greetings, friends. My name is James Howell. Welcome. I'm your host for this new webinar, Wrestling with the Questions That Jesus Asked from Amplify Media. Today, I'm here with my friend and the author of a great new book, Magrey, deVega. Magrey is the senior pastor at Hyde Park United Methodist Church in Tampa, Florida. He's the author of a bunch of books, including this great one. He's a graduate of United Theological Seminary. Nobody's perfect. Everybody doesn't go to Duke Divinity School, and Eckerd College in St. Petersburg, Florida. And he is the father of two daughters, Grace. That's a great name. I've got a Grace, and Madeline. Magrey, thank you so much for joining in this conversation.
James, it's a delight to be here. Thank you for doing this. But I have to admit, the roles feel like they ought to be reversed here. You're the more prolific author and the more profound voice.
So, Magrey, I should know this, but I don't. Where are you from originally?
I was born in Florida. My parents came over from the Philippines in the late 70s. There's a long, beautiful story of immigration from that country to this one. My dad basically decided that if he wanted to start a family, he wanted to give his kids the best shot at the best possible life. So literally with just a couple dollars in his pocket, he came to the United States, and He got married in Florida, gave birth to me, and the rest is history.
That'd be just a whole great video just on just that conversation about your life. But today we are here to discuss Magrey's latest book, The Questions Jesus Asked, a 6-week study in the Gospels. First of all, just thank you for writing this book. Just the title clears a lot of air. I have this memory of in graduate school having a book assigned by a guy named James Breach called The Silence of Jesus. And in it, he talks about stuff that it's obvious if you read the Gospels, but I'd never noticed it. And that is that he talks about what Jesus didn't say. Jesus asked more questions than he answered questions. His stories are open-ended. Did the older brother come into the dinner? What happened to the younger brother? It's always open. Jesus is silent. Jesus must have been like the greatest listener ever. And this is surprising, as you and I are clergy, and people come to us all the time with questions. What's the answer? Jesus didn't give answers. Why do you think Jesus functioned that way?
Well, that's a beautiful sentiment. I remember in seminary learning the phrase narrative gaps, how the Bible doesn't always fill in all the little details. And in some ways, that's an invitation for the reader, the audience, to fill in the gaps with their own experience, their own insights, as a way of extracting biblical truths that are relevant to us. I think that's certainly the case for the way Jesus interacted with people. Perhaps it has something to do with the Greco-Roman style of Socratic dialogue and questions. Perhaps it has to do with the rabbinic tradition, which is built on questions and answers. What's that old joke? Why do Jews answer questions with a question? Answer, how else should they answer questions? I think that's powerful, the way we interact with each other by soliciting answers to some deeper questions. Certainly effective for Jesus, effective for the disciples.
I mean, it's a way of, I think about the Jewish thing. I think about the Cappadocian Fathers, these theologians in the 4th century. They had questions about God, and the way they put it is anytime they got an answer to a question, tucked inside there were 3 more questions. You keep learning, or I wonder if it's in relationships. You know, my wife, she hates it when I tell her how I think she feels, being the brilliant mind reader that I am. And I find if I ask her how she feels, she'll tell me. Because if you ask a question, you're saying to the other person, I trust you. There's something in you. So I know you've experienced what I have. Is church people come in, they're almost apologetic that they have questions. They're almost ashamed. I shouldn't have questions that they feel guilty about, and they want us to answer them. But I mean, every good learning comes because you doubted something, because you had questions about something. That's how you advance into something new. Curiosity, right? It's an underrated virtue.
That's interesting, because the interchange of questions in a particular relationship in some ways speaks of the nature of the relationship themselves. I think about the difference between informing and questioning, just in terms of the teachers that I've had in my life. In elementary school, I'm sure this was the case for you, James, the teachers that I had in kindergarten, elementary school, those are mostly informational, imparting kinds of relationships. Your math tables, your punctuation, your spelling, your grammar rules. This is what you should know. I need you to repeat it back to me. some of the most profound teachers and professors I've ever had were less interested in the informational exchange and more in the interrogative, in the questioning kinds of exchanges. Why do you believe what you believe? What does your belief say about you? That's a much harder and much deeper kind of exchange that, in a sense, defined the relationship I had with those professors. So the professors that are most meaningful to me are the ones who asked good questions and were receptive to the questions that I asked. So I think there's a lot to that in what you're saying.
I mean, certainly for those, you've made me think of professors that have died and gone to glory who meant so much to me, and that they were great askers of questions. It doesn't imply that there wasn't content. It doesn't imply that there's not such a thing as truth, that anything goes, but there's something in that interrogative form that it reshapes how we respond to questions and how we believe what we think. You know, if I ask somebody, I don't know, tell me about your work, tell me about, it's never sort of three facts. There's always a story unfolds. And that's, well, my dad did this, or there's this thing that you did it. You said, well, my dad came over from the Philippines. So it always evokes a story, which is truer to life, anything. But what about that? I mean, if questions are everything, then does just anything go, or isn't there still some truth at the heart of things?
Wow, that's a really good example. Even the opening question you asked of me, which I was not expecting, where was I born? If I simply received that informationally, or in the first category of questions that I talk about in the introduction, the informational kind of thing, I could have said Fort Lauderdale, Florida, and that would have been it, right? If I were to answer it in the second category of questions that I talk about in the introduction, the interpretive, where was I born? Well, I was born in Fort Lauderdale, Florida, because my parents came to the country from the Philippines. But instead, I answered it in the evaluative, that third, that deeper, more profound kind of answer, because of the relationship you and I have. I knew that you were asking something deeper of me, and that solicited more a question of who I am. How do I understand myself in relation to my family? When I shared, my dad wanted his kids to have the best shot at the best possible life. That's not what you were asking me informationally. You were asking something more deeply of me. And frankly, that's why the 6 questions that I lifted out of the many questions that Jesus asked of the disciples felt like they fit into that third category. Not just tell me what you know, informational, not just tell me how you think, the interpretive, but tell me who you are, the evaluative, the questions that get most to the heart of who we see ourselves to be, who we see God to be, and how we see our relationship to God to be.
And the conversation only works if you assume the person asking the question is willing to hear whatever the answer may be, has sort of a hospitality toward it, versus, oh, I have a cousin I'm thinking about, you know, she'll ask you a question, but for her, there's a right and a wrong answer. If you give her the wrong answer, she's ready to give you a thrashing. Jesus, every conversation, Samaritan woman at the well, Nicodemus at night, Jesus asks questions, and there's not a right or wrong answer. There's so much love in that. So your book, it's just so wonderful the way you entertain questions. Always more. You could have written 3 more books with 6 more questions each.
Right.
My favorite question from Jesus, by the way, look this up, is in Mark 9:33. The disciples and Jesus are out walking. They get to the village. I guess they've gotten strung out some. When they get there, Jesus says, "What were you guys talking about along the road?" And they were afraid to answer. I love that. Martin Copenhaver, he's a friend. He counted, I guess, 307 questions.
Yes.
That are asked. And you wonder how many more were asked, you know, over dinner when Jesus was alone with somebody. That's absolutely staggering to me. Your first question that you entertain seems to be such a huge one. You know, who do you say, that identity question? Who do you say that I am? And I love that Peter, he got the right answer, but he misses the point. Which is amazing. That's I would say, for my church people, that'd be the main thing I wish they could rethink. because they think God is kind of the favored over outer, or God is the sort of the moral hammer, or God is the supplier of an emotional rush. But think about who is Jesus. Shifts it from what have you done for me lately, Jesus,
Exactly.
to who are you if I'm going to be near you? And that applies to all relationships, right? It's not, well, what have you done for me lately, Magrey? But I mean, who are you? Talk some about that who is Jesus?
Right. If Jesus were simply asking the disciples that question informationally, that first category, then Peter got the right answer, and the Gospels would have been a lot shorter. But Jesus and our task as preachers would have been a whole lot simpler, because all we need to do is give people the right answer, the right information, the right combination of verbs and nouns to get the answer correct. You are the Christ sent from God. But Jesus was not asking just an informational question, nor was he asking just an interpretive question. Give me your opinion about me. Tell me why you think what you do about me. He was asking the deepest question of all. That's why in the book I emphasize the pronoun. Who do you say that I am? That gets at the heart of Peter's identity. What difference should it make in your life? And you're right. For all of us Christians, we tend to gloss over that third, more profound level of answering that question. In the book, I talk about how to flesh that question out to make it more evaluative. Who do you say Jesus is every day? Not just for one moment in time, not just to pass a confirmation class. Who do you say that Jesus is every day? Second, who do you say Jesus is now in relation to what you said Jesus was for you yesterday or last year? And then what difference does your answer make to your life? I think that's what helps. And there are lots of other ways to embellish that question to make it more personal, more impactful. But I think that's what Jesus was really asking the disciples. What difference does your belief in me make? And that's why Peter's answer wasn't good enough. And that's why Jesus had to say, well, that's an incomplete answer. You don't have all the information yet. There's still things that need to happen. We got to go to Jerusalem, and you'll experience the passion and the cross. And then you'll be ready to answer the question evaluatively, not just informationally.
I mean, I love that you're reminding me of, I had a podcast last year with the Old Testament scholar John Goldingay, and he wrote a great book about the prophets of Israel. And he notes how the prophets, sometimes they're like, do better, get busy, and other times they're comfort. He says the key for the prophets is to know what time it is. Right. So what confuses us, sometimes we want comfort when actually we should be hearing Jesus say, let's get marching and go do something. Right. We get this backwards. And then the people wanting the simple answer. People come to me all the time and they have some vexing, complicated life existential question. And they'll ask it and they'll say, can you give me a Bible verse? I just say, I'm sorry. No. It's a complex question. Life is complex, and Jesus is always going to go into that. And, we live in a day where just personal identity is so up for grabs, and this drives some people crazy and others embrace it. I wonder what is the relationship between our figuring out our identity, but then realizing what Jesus' identity actually is. If we stick close to him, does that help us resolve our own identity struggles?
I think part of the answer comes from the word that you just used about a minute ago, and it's an implicit connecting thread among all these questions and a vital connecting thread throughout one's lifelong journey of faith, and it's the notion of time. I think that's a big factor in the way we hear and respond to the questions of Jesus. Time has an effect on the way we see God in a snapshot in time. And because God is personal and God is relational, then the same dynamics that are at play in any relationship that we have with anybody, whether it's a friend or a loved one, do have contours. It has a landscape. It has an effect of time. You've been married to Lisa for how long, James?
Yeah, 37 years.
37 years. So I would expect that time has been a factor in governing your relationships with each other, the way you understood yourself, the way you understood her, the way you understood your relationship was different during your courtship years than the way that it was when you had kids and empty nesting and the way it is now. This is not to say that God changes. That can be an important aspect of belief for people, that God doesn't change. But certainly our relationship with God changes. Our images for God adapt to our understandings of the world and adapt to who we believe ourselves to be. And so each of these 6 questions are not static in their answers because they're of that third category, because they're evaluative. Time is a factor. The way I would answer the question, why are you anxious, Magrey, is different now than when I was stressing over finals my freshman year in college.
Or different from a week ago.
Or different from yesterday.
So,
or different from from when this webinar began. The time is a factor in all this. And so that's part of what is important about theological reflection. The task of theological reflection needs to be current. And time is definitely a factor in all this.
Your second chapter is on what are you afraid of, right? I see that. How much time do you have, right?
Yeah.
And I'm somebody who, I've said this in sermons several times. When I read in the Bible, either don't be afraid or don't be anxious. That's your third chapter.
Right.
I always say, okay, that's piling on. I already feel afraid and anxious. And I got Jesus telling me not to feel that way. So it's even worse. So Scott Bader Say wrote a great book on Jesus and fear, maybe 10 or 12 years ago. And he points out, I love this. He points out in there, there's good fear and there's bad fear, right? So good fear is you're in the road, there's a truck bearing down on you. You should be afraid and get out of the road. But so many of our fears are irrational. We're afraid of things. Why'd you hit on, you had a lot of questions you could have chosen. Why did you choose that one? Is it your own fears or fears that you sense in people that you know?
I think fear is a universal human quality. You talk about good fears. I think it's built into our survival mechanism as a species. Evolutionarily speaking, fear has helped us survive and evolve. I could answer it in terms of my personality. For those familiar with the Enneagram, I'm a 6, and that is most governed by fear. And so that maybe that's why it's chapter 2, right after the most important question, who do you say that I am? Maybe you're identifying some of my personal bias in lifting that up. But I think that fear is, particularly now in the last 3 or 4 years, fear with the pandemic and all the other unrest in our world, fear is a common factor. But I like the question Jesus asked because of the context of it, in the middle of a storm. And he's asking the disciples who are just in the middle of this chaotic, storm-tossed moment, why are you afraid? The question seems obvious why they're afraid. But then in the book, I talk about listening for the tone of Jesus in the way he asked that question. I talk about an author who talks about 2 different ways to ask the same question. And so if we picture Jesus as asking it in a rebuking kind of way, why are you afraid? As if to say, come on, disciples, you should be better than this. Buck up. There's no reason to be afraid. I find that to be an unhelpful question. But the way we might hear Jesus asking the question, why are you afraid? Why are you afraid? In a way that's really soliciting the deeper stuff within those disciples. The question of their identity. Tell me what you're afraid of. Name it. Externalize it. Give it to me. More of an invitational, welcoming, redemptive way of asking the question. I find that to be a very different and more helpful way to hear Jesus asking that question of me.
And no shaming or belittling in asking.
Oh, no.
I want to write something someday about tone of voice in the Bible. I got to think about John the Baptist. I always hear his tone as repent.
Yes, of course.
But it could be more plaintive, like, oh, please repent, would you? And the fear thing is so. I hope people you wrote about this well. I had Walter Brueggemann on a podcast. he said this amazing thing. He said, everybody is afraid.
Yep. Yeah.
He says, some people are afraid that the world that they've treasured and have built their life on is crumbling around them. And the other people are afraid that the world they dream of will never come to be. I mean, that just explains like what goes wrong in the church, what goes wrong in society and politics and everything else. The anxiety thing, you gave that a whole second chapter. It was good. I'm an anxious person.
I will say, if I may jump in here real quick, one of the guiding principles that helped me pastorally during the pandemic and even today is that whenever I'd interact with a parishioner in whatever state or frame of mind they were in, whether they were upset or worried or complaining, it was to identify, and I learned this from Bishop Ken Carter, our mutual friend. He said, remember that everyone is dealing with some combination of two emotions, fear and grief. And they may not be able to consciously name it as such, but we hear it in the background of everything we say to each other, fear and grief. And what is fear and grief? Grief is an acknowledgement of what we've lost in the past. Fear is an acknowledgement of what we might lose in the future. So we're constantly bifurcated in two directions that are not allowing us to live in the present, either pulled toward a mourning of the past or pulled toward a mourning of the future. And that was extremely helpful to me in my pastoral conversations with people. And I expect that's still the dynamic for most of us today, fear and grief in some way.
It's not going away anytime soon. You know, on the anxiety thing, I was jotting in the margin of your book some stuff I've been thinking about lately. So it's not Jesus, but it's Paul who also says, don't be anxious. That
right
on, I feel more anxious. And I did this thing. I was remembering in seminary, we read Philippians in Greek with a professor named Franklin Young, and he could create more havoc with one Greek participle. It took the whole semester to get through the little short book of Philippians. Anyway, in Philippians chapter 4, that's where Paul says, don't be anxious.
Right.
Oh, but then when you read what he said, it's amazing, right? He says, after don't be anxious, he says, with gratitude, make your requests known to God. This blows me away because I think I grew up thinking, make your request known to God. If God does what you want, you might have some gratitude for God. But instead it says, with gratitude, make your request made known to God. So I've been trying to think about the relationship between gratitude and anxiety. And it seems the more we can discipline ourselves, not just feel gratitude, but discipline ourselves to be grateful, then we're going to look toward the future less with anxiety and more with hope.
Right.
I think.
I appreciate you lifting that up because of all the chapters, it is that third chapter on anxiety that I wanted it to be the most practical, the most relatable in terms of things that people can do. And so I talk about, first of all, I name anxiety as a byproduct of free will. I say, you know, who is never worried? Puppets are never worried. Robots are never worried. Those things that have no free will are never worried. The fact that we have a free will, a byproduct means we worry about things that we can't control because we feel like we should. Anyway, I talk about three sort of practical ways of dealing with anxiety. One is to breathe, to be conscious of our breath. That's an ancient mystical practice. It's connected to the root word of anxiety, which means to choke up. When one feels anxious, it means they can't catch a breath. So there's some breathing practices in that chapter. The second is to talk about interdependence, to surround yourself with community. What is it about lilies and sparrows? You never see them in individuals. You see them in flocks. You see them in fields. But then it's that third thing you talk about, and probably the most practical of all. It's gratitude. I talk about the power of gratitude, the practice of having a gratitude journal. My therapist has helped me develop a gratitude practice where every day I note not just general things that I'm grateful for. I mean, it's easy to say things like I'm grateful for my family, grateful for my job, grateful for my health. But the more specific, the better, she says, because when you identify specific reasons for gratitude, like the way the sun showed through the trees as I was listening to a song, as I was taking the morning walk, That helps you not just identify gratitude in the moment, but hones your antenna for becoming more aware of moments of gratitude throughout your day. And when you do that, that doesn't exactly eradicate all of the anxiety, but it helps alleviate it in an important way.
I mean, I love that. I tend to talk high theology more than giving my people just practical things to do.
Uh-huh.
So I love that. You know, the breathing. I downloaded an app a few years ago. This is app, and you open it, and it tells you how to breathe for the next 5 minutes, and you feel less anxious. Like, that's amazing.
Absolutely.
And then I read this book years ago by this psychiatrist named Martin Seligman. It's called Flourish. And he's not a religious guy, but he says in there, it's like your journal, that if you express gratitude, so you don't just think I'm grateful, but you actually write a thank you note. You make a list at the end of the day of 7 things that went well. If you do that, your anxiety scores go down, your depression scores go down.
Right.
It's so simple.
Right.
Well, let's skip ahead a couple of chapters. The biggest countercultural move you make, I think, in the book is under whom will you love? And that's such a hotly debated topic. And it reminds me of the way that love, for most Americans, I think, it's sort of a mood that surges or it doesn't. Love is a kind of personal preference. Love's purpose is comfort. It's fun. It's pleasure for me. This whom will you love? You're not just asking that question of who's the recipient of it, but you're actually redefining what is that love? What's countercultural about love when we're in Jesus' force field?
Yeah, what's countercultural about this notion of love is the way Jesus commanded us to do it. Some of the hardest stuff that Jesus ever said was to love people we don't want to love. That's why it's hard. Love your enemies, pray for those who persecute you, forgive. It would be a whole lot easier if we loved those who loved us. And Jesus acknowledged that. So in the book, I talk about that classic reframing by Walter Wink that I think all of us preachers have used at one point as to how to reframe the idea of turning the other cheek and going the second mile and giving the person your cloak, not as a sign of weakness or acquiescence. That's not what love means. Love means not just affirming that person's humanity and dignity, but claiming your own. That's why love your neighbor as yourself. Those two things are both sides of the same coin. So loving other people, loving people who are hard to love, does not mean acquiescing or repressing the pain or the harm that you've caused to each other. It certainly means lifting it, naming it, and offering it in some redemptive movement where the two of you can acknowledge it together and may not go back to the relationship as it was before. Again, time is a factor here, but to have a new kind of relationship where you'll stop causing harm to each other, where you'll put the ammunition down. I think that is an act of love. Maybe not the romantic, sentimental kind of love that we often associate, but a love that is redemptive, which is the most important kind of love, the way Jesus described it.
I mean, stop doing harm to the other person, but also stop doing harm to yourself.
Absolutely.
I think St. Augustine said that if you don't forgive someone, there's this poison, and it gets you first. It gets you primarily before it goes to the other person. I've been struck lately. Peter Story, our great friend in South Africa, I don't know if you read his autobiography recently called Protest at Midnight. Just a beautiful, fabulous book. He talks in there so often about forgiveness. And this is between white people, black people, officers, prisoners, people with awful conflict. And they have to move toward forgiveness. And over, he'll say, it was somebody that was horrible. And he'll just say, I'm a Christian. I have no choice. We have to forgive. Forgiveness is so rare in our world. People feel almost a holy justification for their anger and rage at other people.
Well, and you think about the power of those truth and reconciliation committees and how novel and countercultural it was for people to speak their truth and speak their story aloud to their perpetrators and the victims, and to just name it, to externalize it. I think that's at the heart of what many of Jesus's questions were after. is to externalize the fear, the anxiety, the harm, the resentment that we're holding up within us. And by answering the question deeply, the way Jesus would want us to answer it, we're offering it to God for redemption, for transformation.
So this book's great. I don't know if you've ever had this experience. I write a book and then I kind of put it to bed and I forget about it till the publisher sends me a copy. I start thumbing through it, and I always think, oh, why didn't I say this? Right, there's something that I just missed that was so big. But then there are other things I look and it's like, oh, this is my son. I have one son. He's a beautiful son. It's like a child, right? So let me ask this: what moment in this book are you proudest of, happiest about? And then is there anything in this book that makes you kind of shudder a little?
Well, the first part is an easy answer for me. I've said in my own social media that this has aspects of some of my most personal writing, because I share in writing my own faith journey and how the contours of my faith have changed over time. I talk about the model of the three circles, of how our experience and our theology sometimes are in conflict with each other. And in the last chapter, I personalize that with how my own theology, my own understanding of God and the faith in myself has changed from my more fundamentalist days in the way I grew up to where I am now. And I talk a lot about those tension points in early college, early ministry, and even recently, that have really forced me to navigate the tension between the circle of my experience and the circle of my theology, and either expand my interpretation of the experience or expand my theology. And I do it in a personal narrative kind of way. I never thought I would write like that in a Bible study, but it seemed appropriate to do it. And that's why my acknowledgement section is so long at the end, because so many people were factors in the whole faith journey there. What makes me shudder? What makes me shudder is when I continue to ask all 6 of these questions of myself, because I don't want people to get the feeling that even though I answer these questions in a book for people to ponder, that I've got all these answers figured out for myself. There are still things that make me afraid, make me anxious. There's still struggles over what I'm seeking and who I love. And again, the whole theological reflection is an ongoing enterprise. Those circles of experience and theology will constantly rub up against each other. And there's nothing to do except live into that tension and to believe that Jesus welcomes our questions.
I've known older clergy, and I've had older church members that they have just got everything figured out, and they're happy to inform you. And I don't know how at some point I thought, I do not want to grow up to be like that.
Wow.
I had a great friend named Claude Broach. He was a retired Baptist pastor and was a neighbor and got to be a great friend. And I loved late in his life, he was still trying to learn things. I actually visited with him about a week before he died, and he knew he was dying. And I said, Claude, how do you feel about dying? I love what he said. You would expect, right? A pastor said, I'm looking forward to being in heaven. Instead, he said, I am curious. And I thought, that's just the most hopeful thing that I've ever heard, right? He spent his whole life reflecting on God and nearing death. He's curious, right? He wants to see. So speaking of being curious, this last question, I'll ask you this. I love the chapter, what are you looking for?
Yeah.
Where are you going? It reminded me of the great, of course, Thomas Merton thing in Thoughts in Solitude, where he says,
Right.
"For God,
I have no idea where I'm
going.
going.
I don't see the road ahead of me, but
That's
the desire to please you
is
yourself."
Absolutely.
Talk about that, just sort of a direction. Where are you going? What are you looking for? It's so poignant for every person to be able to answer, but hopefully, again, within the force field of Jesus. How does that change it?
Well, I'm not sure if this will fully answer your question, but this feels like the answer to give because it is so timely and recent for me. And it's a personal story. I wasn't even expecting to tell this story, but you've elicited it from me. One of the people I name in the acknowledgement section is a man named Reverend Dr. John A. Stroman, Jack Stroman, who was the longtime senior pastor of Pasadena Community Church in St. Petersburg here in the Bay Area. And he was my senior pastor when I was a youth. He was the one who confirmed me. And he was the one who helped guide me to what eventually would be my call to ministry, which I was not expecting until people like him were part of the picture. I mention him because during my freshman year in college, I went into a crisis of faith where really, for the first time, I felt permission to ask hard questions about my faith. I went to a college as a biology major where I had to learn about evolution, the Introduction to Religious Studies class. I read works by Schleiermacher and Freud and Karl Marx, and that began to unwind a lot of the tightly wound fundamentalism that had become the fabric of my life. And were it not for the United Methodist Church that I had just joined 2 years prior to going to college, and were it not for Jack Stroman, I'm not sure what would have happened to my faith. He gave me permission to ask those questions. He showed me how the history of the Christian church has pivot points where Christians felt the freedom to ask questions and to expand their theology, and that what I was going through was neither uncommon nor unpermissible. If that's
it's even necessary.
It's even necessary.
Yeah.
But I offer his name because even after I was ordained, even after I became a full connection elder, and even after I became a minister, Jack would call me all the time just to ask me questions. I mean, this was a larger in life mentor figure in my life, and he would always call me to get my opinions on things. Magrey, what do you think about the church? Tell me, what do you think about the state of our politics? Tell me, what do you think about the Florida State Seminoles? We had a mutual affection for that. So here is a guy who's been a mentor to me, and he was asking me out of genuine curiosity. By the way, he wasn't testing me. He wasn't asking questions in order to tell me what he thinks. He was teaching me the value of thinking for myself, because he was to have a person like that genuinely interested in what I thought was powerful. It was empowering. And he did that for me all throughout my ministry. And I say this because last Wednesday, just 2 days ago, I learned that Jack died.
Oh.
And I had a final conversation with him. Really, it was a one-way conversation because he wasn't able to respond last Saturday morning. And the family put me on the speakerphone, and I just shared with him, Jack, thank you for always being there for me, for asking me what I thought, for asking questions of me that flexed my muscles and got me thinking about things, because you believe that my answers and my opinion matter. I thanked him for that as he was on his bed. And yeah, I don't know if that's exactly the question you asked, but when you asked the question, what are you looking for? That's the kind of question Jack Stroman would have asked me. And in some ways, I'll continue to hear him asking that of me, just like Jesus did.
I mean, I had an experience recently where I was to give a lecture up at the Festival of Homiletics on hope. Then I had this emergency surgery, and my surgeon said, you ain't flying anywhere. So if that situation, I was in the hospital bed for 15 days. That made me rethink what is hope? And one of the things that I realized in all of this, reading this novel by Joseph O'Connor called In My Father's House, and there's a woman there who, she basically says, hope, it's always another person. There's somebody that cares about you and walks with you. So it's not so much the outcome, but it's whom are you with, and the great joy of ministry, but also just the great joy of the Christian life, being a United Methodist, right? Is this the beautiful people that God brings along our path that we get to be with. You know, the world, people suffer so much, like, oh, he's a great guy. Oh, I mean, he's fun. He's a Duke fan, you know, whatever. They do that stuff, which is fine. But boy, to have a friend like your friend Jack, somebody like that. I mean, that's how Jesus answers questions, maybe, is by sending us
Yes.
people like that.
Yes. Yes. Thank you for lifting that up, because you're right. In addition to time being an implicit factor in the lifelong journey of faith, so is interconnectedness. So is community. Very rarely did Jesus ask questions privately of people. In fact, I could look at this again, but I think every question that he asked here is asked to a community of people, asking for the answers of people who are connected to each other. Certainly the case of the disciples. And so I think you're absolutely right. Our connection to each other matters in the way we answer these questions of Jesus.
Well, and Jesus himself, right? There's an asterisk to every question, which are his last words, which is, "Lo, I will be with you always."
Always.
Right? He doesn't ask you the question and go away. He'll be with you always. Jack will be with you,
yes,
always,
always.
even though he is gone. I'm sorry for the loss of
thank you,
your friend. To those of you who are watching, gosh, thank you so much for joining. This has been a rich, wonderful conversation. I hope you enjoyed this time as much as Magrey and I did. To discover more about the study, go to amplifymedia.com and search for Questions Jesus Asked. Amplify Media has made the first episode of Magrey's study available to watch for free. What a deal. Thank you to Amplify Media for sponsoring the series. You can visit their site to learn more about the resources that they provide for churches. So, friends, I hope you have a wonderful week. And thanks to Magrey for writing such a wonderful book, The Questions Jesus Asked. And thank you for joining us. And have a blessed day, the time that Magrey talks about. Make the most of the time that God has given us. Thank you.